how to design a website that we are going to learn in this course. To learn how to design a website, we have to be the master of 3 programming languages. The first one is HTML, the second one is CSS, and the third one is JavaScript. What is HTML? So it is known as Hypertext Markup language. HTML is a standard markup language for documents designed to be displayed in a web browser. It is the most basic building block of the web. So what we have understood by this statement. So HTML programming is a standard markup language. So we must have noticed that in the websites that we access over the browser, it contains images, videos, textual documents, and so many other elements. All those are known as content. Content are accommodated in a document. So HTML is a standard markup language that is used to incorporate those all the contents in a web page. So that we are going to learn step by step. HTML defines the structure and layout of a web document. So the document that is available in the web server, HTML defines its structure by using a variety of tags and attributes which are interpreted by web browser software to display the pages. So we access the web pages in our browser, and all the content and all other the text, video, and so many other varieties of elements, those are available in the web pages. Those are structured by the HTML tag that we are going to learn step by step. So there are hundreds of tags used to format and lay out the information in a web page. So there are many tags of HTML. Okay, so we are going to learn the most important tags which we can execute during our practical exercise. So tags are also used to specify hypertext links. So all this we are going to learn step by step in the practical session. So let us know what is the CSS. So it is normally known as Cascading Style Sheet. Cascading Style Sheet is a style sheet language used for describing the presentation of a document written in the HTML markup language. CSS is a style sheet language used for describing and presentation of a document written in HTML markup. So what we have understood by the statement written here. So that is Cascading Style Sheet. In short, it is known as CSS. It defines how the HTML tag will appear in the browser. It defines the presentation of the document to be shown in the browser. So after we incorporate the HTML tag, we have to apply the CSS, that is Cascading Style Sheet, to those HTML elements so that it will be appearing good in the web browser. So there are normally 3 types of CSS: inline CSS, internal or embedded CSS, and external CSS. All these things we will learn step by step in the practical sessions. So the inline CSS is normally written in the opening tag of the HTML element, and the internal or the embedded CSS are written inside the head of a web page. So the internal or the embedded CSS are written inside the header of a web page. Okay, inside the header, also it is to be written inside the style opening and closing tag. All this thing will be learned in the practical session. And the external CSS are external file that is to be written separately, and that external file has to be linked with the HTML document. So all these things we will be discussing later on step by step. And the JavaScript, so that is the third programming language, is very useful to design web pages. So JavaScript is a text-based programming language used both on the client side and server side that allows you to make web pages interactive. Okay, so understand the word interactive. So JavaScript gives web pages interactive elements that engage a user. So by using JavaScript, we do create certain event in the web pages so that it can be interact with the user who are using the web pages. So we have understood, we have drawn the queries that by using JavaScript we can create a interactive web pages. Okay, so JavaScript is a dynamic programming language that is used for web development, in web applications, for game development and lots more. It allows you to implement dynamic feature on web pages that cannot be done with only HTML and CSS. So we need to understand one thing, that we can design our website by just using HTML and CSS, but that website is not going to interact with the user unless we implement JavaScript to the web pages. So JavaScript will create certain action event which will let the user to interact with the web pages. Using JavaScript we can do certain validations, interactive events and so on. So we must have played computer games, lots of games that we do play in the browser. Those are built and developed by using the JavaScript. So we must have noticed one thing, that in game user, that is the player, used to interact with the browser by clicking several events by button, and not only by button, it is also applicable time session. So the time session also play a very vital role during the execution of certain games. So all these events, all the creation of interactive modes are being exercised and implemented by using the JavaScript. So all these things are very important. To design a proper website we have to learn HTML, CSS and at last JavaScript. The most important thing is HTML, because only by using HTML we can access the content from the server. Without using the HTML we cannot access any content from the server, because the content that we are going to access from the server will download in form of hypertext link. Then only we can able to see those in our browser. So HTML is the most important thing that we have to learn at first. And the second important thing is that CSS. Why? By exercising the cascading style sheet we can define the style, shape, presentation of the layout. How will the layout appear in the browser? How will all the HTML tag will be presented to the user? All these things can be defined by using the style sheet, that is CSS. And third but not the least, JavaScript can be used in some of the websites, if not all. So JavaScript will also help to create user interactive mode. So we have understood that HTML is the most important thing. CSS is required to be implemented in modern days websites so that it could be appear good and better in the browser, and JavaScript can be implemented with the website so that it will be an interactive user page, right? And let us understand another thing. So what is the difference between website and web pages. So what is website? We must have noticed that there are many websites that we do access from our mobile phone, from the tablet, from the computer, laptop, and so and so. So all the websites is nothing but collection of web pages. So the web page is a single document on the web using a unique URL, while a website is a collection of multiple web pages in which information on a related topic or another subject is linked together under the same domain address. So what have we drawn the meaning by this given text statement? So web page includes all content. It could be textual content, images, videos, and many other things. So a single web page can have many given content, right? And we can access that web page through a URL. So we have to type a particular URL in the browser, then only we can be able to access the web page. Now what is website? Website is collection of such pages. So the page which we access from the browser, so collectively collection of many pages are known as a complete website. Please do pay attention and understand one thing, is that we have observed that in a website there are multiple menus. So by clicking to those menus we can access different web pages. So there are home, about us, contact us, and so many other menus, and user click those menus and visit separate web pages. So after accessing a particular website we can visit to different web pages, right? That means website is a collection of all web pages, and all the web pages are linked under the same domain. That is, if you go and click amazon.com, so in amazon.com you will have multiple web pages, but first we access the domain, that is amazon.com, and then by clicking to several menus we can visit different other web pages. So I hope you have understood what is the basic difference between web page and the websites. Now domain. What is domain? Domain is a name of a website. Not only a name, that is to be a unique name. After the www dot in the web address we type the domain name. So let us see some of the example of domain names, that is google.com, facebook.com, and amazon.com, and there are so many other domain names. So these are the unique name given to a particular server. So where our data, what is the data I am talking about? I am talking about the web pages. So all the web pages are kept inside a folder. Where that folder do exist? That folder do exist in a particular server. Server is nothing but a computer, and this computer is connected all over the public network. That is, all the computers which can be accessed publicly over the internet, that is called a web server. So web server are always accessible publicly over the internet, having a public IP address. And what is domain name? Domain name maps the unique public IP address with a unique host name, or you can say a name for that given server or that given system. That name is mapped with the unique IP address. Okay, so we also have to understand what is the DNS server. So the DNS server, it is known as domain name system server. That is a server, okay, it is specially used for matching web host name like amazon.com to their IP address. The DNS server contains a database of public IP address and their corresponding domain name. So what have we understood by this statement? So DNS is nothing but a computer. You can say a highly configured computer or a server. Server is also a computer. So that server or the computer have a database, and in that database pool it contains the IP address, the public IP addresses of all the devices connected publicly over the network. Okay, and to access those devices it must have a domain name. Okay, and the corresponding unique host name, or you can say unique domain name, that is mapped with the public IP address. So DNS server play this role. Okay, it apply a special software to access the request by the domain name and send the response with the public IP address to the user. And what is web hosting? Web hosting refers to an online server that enable you to publish a website on the internet. It is basically like paying rent for a space on a physical server to store files of the data. All the data are stored that make up your website to ensure that your website is functioning properly. So what we have understood by this statement about the website hosting? Website hosting is nothing but, as after creating the websites, what do? We keep the web pages and other related content such as photo, video, text in our system. So if we keep those data in our system, that can only be accessed by us. Okay, and if we keep those data in our system, and if our system is connected with 2 or 3 or more computers through the network, those data can also be accessed by other user accessing the network, but that will never going to be accessed outside the network. To get those data accessed publicly all over the world, we have to save those data in a server. Server is nothing but a computer, but that server must be connected publicly, having the public IP address over the network, so that anywhere from the world can access all the data. So what we do during the web hosting? We pay some money and occupy some space of a server. That means we occupy some space of a computer hard disk, but that computer is having a public IP address, and that computer is also connected over the network. So that is the server, and we have hosted our data in that particular server, so that all over the world, anybody sitting anywhere, any corner of the world can access those content, those websites which we have kept in that server, because that server has a public IP address and that server is connected to all the network over the world. So that is when we do the website hosting. We pay rent for accessing that particular server and for using the space of that particular server. This process is known as web hosting. Let us understand the diagram. So we can observe out here a cloud. Okay, so a cloud that is connected with many server and computers, right? And what is cloud? Cloud is a concept. Cloud is a conceptual diagram where all the public devices can be connected over through in order to share their resources through unique public IP addresses. So public IP addresses will always be accessed over the network, right? You can see Facebook server, Google server, DNS server, Amazon server, and also many other client computers. So the client computers are normal users using their desktop or laptop who are going to access the Facebook server, Amazon server, or the Google server over the internet. So what we do actually, we first send our request to the DNS server. Right now DNS server send us the reply. So what we do actually, in our browser we type, let's say, facebook.com. so all the devices over the network has unique public IP address, right? And it is quite difficult for user to remember the IP addresses, because IP addresses are a complex number to be remembered, right? So it is quite easier for us to remember the domain name. Let us say, for an example, the IP address of Facebook, that is 69.176.13.69. Is it easy for us to remember? No, never. But it is easy for us to remember facebook.com, right? So we will type in our browser, let's say, facebook.com. This request will first go to the DNS server. You can see the DNS server that is connected over the network. Now a client over the wall will first access the DNS server. Now DNS server has a database pool where all the domain name is written along with their associated IP address. Now if the user type in the browser facebook.com, so now the request will first go to the DNS server. The DNS server will check the database and finds out that the IP address for the request, that is facebook.com, is 69.176.13.69. Then after knowing the IP address, this IP address as a response will be passed to the client. Now again the DNS server will send the response to the client. Now client system now comes to know that what is the IP address of facebook.com. Now again client system, after knowing the IP address, will automatically send the request to the Facebook server through the IP address, right? Now it is the role of the DNS server to remember all the public IP addresses through which it can be accessed over the network by using the domain name. So you can see the DNS records where the DNS server keep all the IP addresses in track with its associated domain name. So we have understood that we, the user, type the domain name and the request goes to the DNS server, and DNS server finds out the IP address for the associated domain name and send us the response in way of IP address. Now our system comes to know about the IP address, and then it can access that device through the IP address directly over the network, right? This is the process, and this is the importance of the DNS server. So that is why we need to buy a domain name. Unless we buy a domain name, we can only access the data, the content, that is the web pages, through the IP address. So if we have not purchased the domain name, we have to remember the IP address, and we have to provide the IP address to the users who are going to access our website. So it is quite complex thing to be remembered, the IP addresses. So if we had to publish our websites, then we need to provide the IP address of the server where our data will be saved to all the users who are going to access our content. And if we have to get it easy for the users, then we can do one thing. We can purchase or we can hire a domain name that is a unique host name, and we can map the unique host name with the IP address by using the DNS server, okay? And after that domain name can be easy for our user to remember, so that they can access our websites through the network easily. And also we have to do the hosting. Unless we do the hosting, the websites will never going to be accessed by the public user. I hope you have understood the concept of DNS server and the domain name system. Now another thing we do need to learn, that is how we send request to the server. So we are the client and we send request to the server by the HTTP request. Hypertext Transfer Protocol. This is a protocol that helps the browser to send the request to the server. So when we type the domain name or the IP address in our browser, it uses the Hypertext Transfer Protocol to send our request to the intended server. Now the server, after knowing the request, send us the Hypertext Transfer Protocol response, that is the HTTP response to us in way of the content, that is the data which are saved in the server, in form of HTML tag, that is hypertext links, and those are downloaded in the client side browser. And after those are downloaded in the client side browser, client can access, or you can say client can see those in the browser in form of websites. Let us understand what is URL. So we have to type the URL in the browser, and after that we can access the website. So what is URL? So Uniform Resource Locator. So it is a uniform resource locator. What does it mean? So in a server, the data are located, right? The HTML pages, other content, video, images, and so many content are saved, stored in a particular server. Okay, so by accessing the uniform resource locator, we can access those data. So we have to address where the data are stored in our browser, then only we can access that particular server and fetch the data. Okay, otherwise how will we going to fetch the data? Okay, will we going to fetch the data? How? Only by accessing the URL. So we have to write the exact specific URL in our browser, then only we can access those data which are kept in the server. So let us understand what does HTTPS means. So that is a protocol. Okay, by Hypertext Transfer Protocol we going to access the data from the server. So the first, that is HTTPS, the first words. So that is the protocol that we are going to use during this communication, right? And after that GYAAN, what does it mean? It is a domain name. So instead of using the IP address, we can also use the domain name. So IP address of what? IP address of the server where the data are saved. So as I told you, if we have the domain name mapped with the associated IP address, instead of using the IP address we can also use the domain name. So the domain name instead of using IP address can be easier for the user to remember, right? So the here the domain name has been used, that is GYAAN. So that is the domain name. And .com, what is .com? That is the top level domain. So .com, .in, .org, those are the top level domains. So under the top level domain we have our unique domain name, right? And now slash index.php, what is that? That is the file name. That file name we are going to access. So this index.php is saved in a particular server, and that server has a IP address. So we have to access the server by actually accessing that IP address, but it is difficult to remember the IP address. That is why that IP address is mapped with a domain name, that is GYAAN. So here I have not used the IP address. Instead of that IP address, this domain name will be used. So by this domain name we will send the request to the DNS server. Now DNS server know the IP address because in its database table the IP address is saved with its associated domain name. After DNS server receive the request, DNS server will let us know the IP address. So now our computer will came to know about the IP address of the system where the data are saved. Now after that the system will again send request to that particular server directly, and it can access the file, that is index.html, index.php file from the server. Okay. Now it is the example of another URL. One extra thing that has been added, please observe, that is HTTPS, that is the networking .gyll. So one networking, so that word has been added. It is called subdomain. So what is subdomain? Subdomain can be created under the domain. So after you have purchased a domain, you can create multiple subdomain under that domain. That means inside that domain you will have multiple websites. So you can just purchase one domain and you can create multiple websites. And what you can do, all those websites can have a unique name, that is known as subdomain, right? Under that domain you can have multiple subdomain. So you can see all are same domain followed by top level domain and at last the file name. So it is a index.php file, you can have index.html file. So there are so many files you can have, and you can see this is another example, networking.gyll, and you can observe. So as I told you, inside the domain you can have multiple subdomain, right? You can see under the gyll domain there we have networking.gan.com, competitive.gan.com, interview.gan.com, website.gan.com. So under a single domain you can have multiple subdomain. That means you can create multiple websites. Each website is a collection of web pages. So multiple website you can create, and under a single domain you can map those. That means under a single public website you can have multiple sections of your websites. So you need not require to purchase multiple server, multiple spaces for creating multiple websites. Just it is enough to have one server and host your data there, and you can have multiple websites. So we also have to understand another very important thing before we move to the practical session. So HTTPS and HTTP, what is those? Let us understand. So we must have noticed in the browser that some websites start with HTTPS and some websites start with HTTP. So HTTPS is nothing but actually HTTP with encryption. So Hypertext Transfer Protocol with encryption. So we know that during the request that client send to server and server respond to the client, this is being done by a Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And what is HTTPS? That is actually Hypertext Transfer Protocol with the encrypted formation, right? So the only difference between two protocols, that is the HTTPS uses SSL to encrypt normal HTTP request and response. So we have understood it just encrypt the data. During this protocol played significant role during this request and response transmission to client and server over the network. So during this process the data are passes in encrypted format, right? So this is the difference. SSL stands for secure socket layer, and in short it is the standard technology for keeping an internet connection secure and safeguarding any sensitive data that is being sent between two systems, preventing criminals from reading and modifying any information transferred, including potential information, that is personal details. As a result, HTTPS is far more secure than HTTP. An SSL certificate is a bit of code on web server that provides security for online communications. When a web browser contacts your secured website, the SSL certificate enables an encrypted connection. it is like sealing the information in an envelope before sending it through the mail. So what does it do? We know that Hypertext Transfer Protocol plays its significant role during the communication of data from client and server. Request and response. Request sent by the client, response sent by the server. So this happens during a transformation, during a transition of data over the network for accessing the website. So when this thing happens, the data are accessed from the server to the client. Okay, so when this thing takes place, the secure socket layer plays a vital role. It keeps all the data after connection has been established in secure format, and data are passed in encrypted manner so that it can give security, and it safeguards the sensitive data during the transmit, so that the criminal, the hackers who are sitting there to fetch the data over the network, they will be not able to identify the exact data which are being passed over the network, right? You can understand the same by this diagram. Observe the diagram at the right. There is HTTP at the first. You can see when the transmission has been taken place, if the password is being transmitted over the network, that is, you can say the password is GYAAN. You can see while using the HTTP protocol, the hackers can easily see what the password is over the network. Okay, because the Hypertext Transfer Protocol that has been used for the first case, and below and the diagram you can see the HTTPS. So a secure socket there has been played its significant role with the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It encrypted the data. The password has been encrypted with a significant value that could not be understood by the hackers. Okay, the actual password was GYAAN, but that password is kept hidden by the encrypted value. So the hackers can only identify the encrypted value, but it cannot discover what the password was. By that value, it is quite difficult for the hackers to get the exact password. So when the password is encrypted with the hash value, it is quite difficult for the hackers to do its and play its tricks, right? So that is why the HTTPS plays significant role to secure your data, your personal data that is to be accessed over the network, right? That is why we are doing the banking transaction, we can see all the time it is used by the secure socket layer. That is, we only access HTTPS while we doing the banking transaction. Okay, and we have also observed in the browser, just observe the left side diagram. You can see in HTTP it is quite insecure, and HTTPS you can see the below diagram, it is secure and a lock appears. So in the browser we do observe this lock while we are accessing the sites which HTTPS. So this is the difference between HTTP and HTTPS. So during the time of hosting, we have to consider either we can use the HTTP protocol or we can use the HTTP protocol with the secure socket layer, so that we can access the encryption of the data. So the data which can be accessed over the network, that will be done in an encrypted way. So we can go for the SSL certificate with an additional during the hosting. So that will be discussed later. This is the theory time to understand basic things. So what is browser? We also need to understand the browser. A browser takes you anywhere on the internet. So it retrieves information from other part of the web and display it on the desktop of or a mobile device. So the information is transferred using the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which defines how text, image, video are transmitted over the web browser. So what is browser? Browser is nothing but an application that is installed in your computer, and only by browser you can access the data in form of hypertext link. So all the data, those are saved in the web server or the other computers publicly connected over the internet. So all the content which are saved, the content can be saved in form of images, videos, text, and those content can be accessed through your browser. So those content in form of hypertext links will download in your browser, then only we can able to see those content. So that is what the browser plays the significant role to access the websites, right? So this is how the browser looks on your desktop. So there are different kinds of browser, different application, Mozilla, Google Chrome, Safari, Internet Explorer. So all those are different form of browser. You can use any of those browser and you can install those at your system. Another thing, where we are going to write the HTML, CSS or JavaScript program. So for writing those programs we need some text editor. So there are many text editor available, open source text editor available over the internet. We can download those freely without cost, right? The very easy text editor that is normally found pre-installed in our system, that is Notepad. You can start with the Notepad. You can find that is installed by default in your system. Other than Notepad you can use Notepad++, NetBeans and so on. There are many text editors. So using those text editor we have to write the HTML program. So that we are going to discuss from the next classes. We will start the practical exercise. So do subscribe this channel for all the lectures that will be discussed regarding these programming languages. We will design some very interesting websites, web layout,